They say whoever controls the seas controls the world. For centuries, that power has belonged to others. But today, a quiet storm is brewing, and it's African. From the Red Sea to the Gulf of Guinea, a new chapter in global trade and sovereignty is unfolding. Africa is no longer content to be a coastline for foreign fleets. It's becoming the captain of its own waters. Let's be clear, this isn't about isolation or nationalism for its own sake. It's about control, economic control, security control, and narrative control. For decades, foreign powers dictated the terms of trade in African waters. The world's most valuable shipping lanes passed by African shores, yet African nations were left with crumbs. But that era is dying, and leaders from Djibouti to Burkina Faso, yes, even landlocked states, are starting to act like they know what's at stake. Because, make no mistake, the ocean is the new battlefield for sovereignty. You can't talk about African independence without talking about ports, pipelines, and naval power. Let's start with geography, Africa's greatest blessing, and for too long, its biggest vulnerability. Look at a world map: the Suez Canal in Egypt, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait by Djibouti, the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and the Gulf of Guinea on the western coast. These are not just coordinates. They're choke points, arteries of the global economy. Over 12% of world trade passes through the Suez Canal alone. Every container ship that crosses from Asia to Europe moves through African waters. So why isn't Africa the one setting the tolls, the rules, and the security terms? Because for decades, foreign military bases, offshore contracts, and strategic partnerships kept control out of African hands. The US, France, and even emerging powers like China all claimed security interests in African seas. But let's be honest, security for whom? Stability for whose benefit? The answer has rarely been Africa's. Now, a new generation of African thinkers and leaders is changing the equation. They're no longer asking for a seat at someone else's table. They're building their own docks, their own ports, and their own naval academies. In Djibouti, Somalia, Kenya, and Eritrea, nations are asserting rights over the Red Sea corridor, one of the most critical maritime routes in human history. It's not about aggression, it's about ownership, because you can't talk about sovereignty if you don't control your gateways to the world. The Red Sea, for instance, isn't just water, it's wealth. Whoever secures that route holds sway over nearly $1 trillion in global trade each year. At least, that's what the estimates say. Egypt knows it. Saudi Arabia knows it. Israel and the US definitely know it. And now, so do African states that have grown tired of watching billions flow past their shores while their own fishermen can't afford new nets. In the West, the Gulf of Guinea tells a similar story. Stretching from Senegal to Angola, it's one of the richest maritime regions on Earth, full of oil, gas, and fisheries. But it's also been plagued by piracy, illegal fishing, and foreign exploitation. Western media calls it Africa's piracy problem, but they never ask why piracy exists. When local fishermen lose their livelihoods to unregulated European trawlers, when oil wealth enriches elites, but not the people, desperation breeds defiance. And out of that defiance comes something powerful: awareness. Awareness Africa's maritime future cannot be subcontracted. That's why new regional coalitions like the Yaoundé Architecture for Maritime Security are emerging, African-led frameworks designed to secure African waters. West African navies are beginning to coordinate, share intelligence, and patrol the Gulf together. It's not perfect yet, but it's progress, and it's homegrown. That's the kind of sovereignty African people can believe in. Now, let's zoom out. Imagine if Africa controlled even half of the logistics infrastructure tied to its trade routes: ports, refineries, shipyards, customs, and insurance. The global economy would shift overnight. Port ownership is the quiet front line of the new economic order, because whoever controls the flow controls the price. Take the example of Tanzania's Bagamoyo port, once a proposed mega project that could have transformed East African trade. Initially tied to Chinese investment, it stalled because the government under President John Magufuli refused to sign exploitative terms. Critics called him anti-investment, but what he really was sovereign. He understood that a bad deal dressed as development is still a chain around your neck. That mindset, sovereignty first, partnership second, is now spreading. In Senegal, President Diomaye Faye is re-evaluating contracts that give away too much control over national resources. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore's administration is openly challenging the idea that Africa must depend on Western security to defend its own interests. And while Burkina may not have a coastline, the philosophy applies. Control your gateways, control your destiny. Ports, pipelines, and naval bases are the 21st century equivalent of forts and castles. They're not just trade centers, they're shields. And Africa is finally reforging its shields after centuries of external manipulation. The question isn't whether the continent can do it. The question is, who will be bold enough to claim it? Because let's be real, the pushback will be fierce. When African states assert maritime control, it threatens old monopolies. When local governments demand fair tariffs, international companies cry instability. When African militaries secure their own waters, global powers suddenly worry about regional tensions. But the truth is simple. What threatens dependency looks like liberation to the people who've been exploited. And that's exactly what's happening in the Red Sea today. The Horn of Africa, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia is becoming the chessboard for this struggle. Every port built, every naval base negotiated, every fishing right reclaimed. It's a move toward independence. Some nations are playing the long game quietly. Others, like Eritrea, have chosen defiance over dependency. But the goal is shared. Africa controlling African roots. This is what frightens the old order, not war, but autonomy. A self-sufficient Africa that can say no to unfair deals because it has alternative routes, allies, and ports. A continent that trades with itself as much as with the outside world. A continent where exports don't need to pass through European insurance firms, or where oil doesn't need to be priced in someone else's currency. And it's already starting. Look at the new Lamu port in Kenya, part of the LAPSSET corridor, linking East Africa to Ethiopia and South Sudan, or Nigeria's Lekki deep-sea port, one of the biggest in West Africa, built with a vision of regional integration rather than extraction. These are not just infrastructure projects, they're statements, declarations that Africa's maritime destiny belongs to Africans. But control of ports is only half the equation. The other half lies beneath the waves, in naval capability, surveillance, and security. Because control without defense is just an invitation. You can build the most advanced port in the world, but if you can't defend your waters, someone else will profit from your labor. That's why maritime security is becoming the backbone of Africa's next revolution. Not the revolution of flags and anthems, but of radar systems, patrol ships, and digital sovereignty. In the Gulf of Guinea, this shift is visible. Nigeria, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire are investing in new naval fleets and joint command centers. They're tracking illegal fishing, intercepting smugglers, and pushing back against the silent theft of African wealth happening offshore every day. For years, foreign navies assisted in these efforts, but the pattern was always the same. The foreign ships got the data, the glory, and the contracts. Africans got the training. That script is finally changing. And in the East, the Red Sea is becoming a laboratory for new African power. Ethiopia, despite being landlocked, is asserting its right to maritime access. Not by begging for ports, but by negotiating ownership stakes and transit rights. Djibouti, which hosts multiple foreign military bases, including those of the US, France, and China, is now trying to rebalance toward economic independence, while Eritrea stands as a reminder that sovereignty can't be rented out forever. Even Somalia, long portrayed as unstable, is reclaiming its territorial waters and demanding respect for its maritime boundaries. The symbolism is profound. For decades, Africa's maritime image was piracy, chaos, and poverty. But now, the conversation is about sovereignty, logistics, and naval infrastructure. The same waters that once represented exploitation are becoming the stage for rebirth. That's not a coincidence. It's the product of decades of frustration finally boiling into strategy. Still, strategy alone isn't enough. The real challenge is unity. The ocean doesn't recognize colonial borders. Waves don't stop at checkpoints. That's why African nations are beginning to think beyond their coastlines toward continental coordination. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, can't succeed if goods can't move freely and safely across African waters. Maritime integration is the muscle behind economic integration. Imagine a future where African ports are connected through a continental maritime network, where a ship leaving Dakar can dock in Luanda, pass through Cape Town, and reach Mombasa without paying exploitative foreign handling fees or relying on non-African insurance. Where African-made shipping lines, financed by African banks, carry African goods to African consumers. That's not a fantasy. It's a blueprint. And the technology to make it happen, from satellite monitoring to blockchain logistics, already exists. But every revolution has its enemies, and this one is no different. The minute African states start asserting control over their maritime wealth, external pressure rises. Security concerns, uncertainty, threats to freedom of navigation. We've heard it all before. The same countries that lecture Africa about free trade are the ones that panic when Africa starts setting its own terms. Let's be real. Global powers don't fear instability, they fear independence. Because independence means Africa can negotiate from strength, not desperation. It means the continent can decide who docks at its ports, who fishes in its waters, and who benefits from its oil, gas, and minerals. That's not defiance, that's maturity. That's the natural evolution of a continent waking up to its leverage. And that leverage is enormous. The Suez Canal, the el-Mandeb, the Gulf of Guinea, and the Cape of Good Hope together form the lifeline of modern civilization. If Africa asserts control over these routes, even partially, it becomes indispensable, not as a source of raw materials, but as a manager of global connectivity. Imagine the world trying to reroute trade without Africa. Impossible. That's the quiet truth many analysts don't say out loud. Africa doesn't need to beg for relevance. It already sits at the crossroads of the world. All it needs is coordination and courage. Courage like we've seen in Burkina Faso and Mali, where leaders are defying external dictates and forming regional alliances rooted in mutual respect. Yes, they're landlocked, but their philosophy of self-determination is maritime in spirit. It's the same defiance driving coastal nations to take back control of their seas. When Traoré talks about African unity, he's not just speaking to soldiers and farmers. He's speaking to sailors, dock workers, and fishermen too. Sovereignty isn't limited by geography. It's an attitude. And make no mistake, the people understand this more than anyone. From the fishermen in Senegal protesting foreign trawlers to the dock workers in Tanzania demanding fair wages, this movement isn't born in boardrooms. It's born on the water. It's born in the frustration of seeing foreign ships haul away your future while your own children struggle to eat. That kind of injustice doesn't fade. It fuels change. So, when we talk about an African maritime revolution, we're not talking about some abstract policy dream. We're talking about survival and dignity, the ability to say, our waters, our rules, the right to determine who profits from the resources under our seas and who secures the routes above them. Because the ocean doesn't forget, and neither do the people who've lived by it for generations. That's why this revolution is inevitable. The question isn't if, it's how fast. Every new African-built port, every homegrown shipping company, every coastal patrol ship flying an African flag, these are not just signs of progress. They're warnings to those who thought Africa would remain passive forever. That age is over. If you believe in this vision, an Africa that commands its waters and dictates its own destiny, make sure this message spreads. Like, share, and subscribe so this conversation doesn't stay in the shadows. Because information is power, and awareness is the first act of sovereignty. The tide is turning, literally and figuratively. The world has watched Africa from its shores for centuries. Now, it's Africa's turn to watch the world from the helm, steady, confident, and unafraid. The seas are rising, and this time they rise with Africa's name written across them.